In this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to build this toast notification system in our React Native app. So I have the Android emulator and the iOS emulator. So on the iOS, we have different buttons, and each of these different buttons triggers a toast to show up with a different configuration. So when I click on show success, notice that we get a toast that actually shows up and it comes in green, and after 5 seconds it just goes away. Same thing happens on Android, as you can see. When we click on show error, you will see we get an error toast fading, and it's gonna take 5 seconds and it's gonna disappear. Alright, so we have another one for the info, and that worked. That should have actually been success, but we also can be able to trigger this toast with custom settings. For example, here you see when I click on take 10 seconds, we get this darker one that comes, and it actually is gonna take up to 10 seconds before it actually disappears. On Android, we have a way that we can trigger the app to use the native toast component that React Native exposes on Android, but that's not available in iOS, and that's why you don't see that button in the iOS UI. If I go to the details screen and actually come back here, you're gonna see that we get the toast actually being shown, right? So this toast here is triggered on user events. So it's something to demonstrate that you don't actually have to trigger this manually, but you can trigger it maybe when something happens in your app, or when maybe the user's credentials are not correct. So you don't have to trigger it by the buttons, you know. Our toast system is going to be global, meaning that it doesn't really matter where the user is. For example, here you can see that we have it showing here, and I can still navigate through the app and it is still taking position, and the user can still look at it. We'll also take a look at how to make it that the user can actually define what should happen when they click on it. So in this case, whenever we click on it, we actually go ahead and dismiss the toast. If you're interested in learning React Native, building cool things with it, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, makes me know that you guys care about this stuff, and that way I can make videos like this in the future. Alright guys, so if you want to follow along, I've created a repository here called React Native Toast App, and I have a branch here called Start here. So what you want to do is you want to clone this project and actually check out this branch, and then you're gonna be having the same exact code like I have, because I'm also on that branch. So we have a React Native project. It's using React Native 65.1. So I've gone ahead to set up React Navigation and also React Native Reanimated. So we're going to be using this for the fade effect. Alright, so I've also created a button component, and this is giving us those buttons you see on the screen. And here I have two screens, the home screen, which is what you're seeing, and the detail screen. The idea is we want to be able to do something like toast, then we call the type of the toast, something like success, right? Then we give it some configurations. Let's say we give it a message, which a message can be like a string that says, so we also should be able to specify some other configurations like duration. Maybe we can say, okay, this should take 5 seconds. We'll also be able to define what type of notification we want to use on Android. Either we want to use this custom one we are creating, or use the one that's on Android. So something like use Android native toast. Let's say true here. So whenever we do something like this, we expect to get that green toast. When we do like info, we should get that dark text. When we do like danger, we should get that red text, depending on how we configure our colors for this, right? So some of these are going to be default, so we don't have to specify this every time, right? And we also don't have to specify this every time. So we're going to have some default values for it, so that we can only be able to call it by doing something like toast.this. So since we are going to have different configurations for like the types, what I want to do is in the root of the project, I want to create a folder called helpers, and in there I'm going to have a toast.js file. So inside here we're going to create a toast. It's going to be an object. So here we can define the functions on that toast. So we're going to have the info function, and that's going to be a function, of course, and obviously should be able to trigger the info toast. So we're also going to have the success and also the danger and also the danger. Alright, so what these functions are going to be doing is they are going to be dispatching an event to the whole app. Now we are going to be using a module called device event emitter from React Native. So what this allows us to do is we can be able to broadcast events through the application, and then those events can be listened to from other modules. So we can be able to do something like device event emitter, then we do emit. So we emit an event type. So here let's say the event type would be to show a toast, right? Something like show toast. So we can be able to emit an event which can be listened to. In our case, we're going to be listening to it from from our toast component. When emitting this event, we can also be able to send custom data that can be accessed from the listener module. So whenever we call this toast here, we're going to be passing it an object, and this is the data that we want to be sending to the listener component. So here we can access it as options. So whenever we get it, then we can be able to also forward it to the listener. So we're going to go ahead and spread the object, and also we need to be able to send the type itself. And since it's not sent through the options, what we can do here is we can also specify it manually, and in this case the type is going to be info, right? So I'm going to actually copy everything and replace these two. So now we can change this to success. Let's change this to danger. Alright, so now we are done with part 1, and let's go ahead and export the toast. So export default toast, just so we can import it and use it when we are triggering it. Actually, what I want to do is, since we are still here, is to actually refactor this one out and put it in a separate module, just so we don't actually misspell it somewhere. So I'm going to change this one to show toast message as the event name, and I'm going to go and put it somewhere separate in the application, just so we don't actually misspell it anywhere. So let me change this one to toast.js and export const toast show toast message, and the value can be anything. We are just using it to uniquely identify this event, right? So here, instead of using the hard-coded one, we can just go ahead and import the one we created in one place, and that should do the same thing, but this is just a modular way of writing it, just so we don't accidentally misspell it in the usages and cause some bugs for ourselves. Alright, so now we need to set up a module that should be able to listen to these events. So to do that, we're going to go to our components. So I have a components folder. Right now we only have the button, and I'm going to create a toast.js file. This is going to be a React component, and it's going to be called toast. So right now what I want to do is do hello world here, just so we can make sure it is working. And what we're going to do is set up a listener that is going to listen to the other event, right? Remember the event we dispatched from the toast helper. So we're going to need to register a listener for it. So here we're going to have a use effect. So a use effect is going to get called when this component gets mounted. It's going to now start listening for when the other event is emitted. So what you can do here is we are still going to use the device event emitter, and we want to call add event listener. So then we specify the event we want to listen to. So in this case, we want to listen to the toast message event, right? And then we are going to need to handle it. So on here, we can specify a callback function that gets past the data that this got called with. So let's say it got called. So whenever we emitted, let's say, a message like hello world, we can have a function that picks out those messages, right? And maybe things like the types and all that stuff. So we're going to have a function called on new toast, and this is going to be responsible to pick out the data and pass it to our toast component, and the toast component can display things in the UI, right? So let's have that function. So it's going to be a function, and like we said, it gets access to the extra data that we send. So we're going to pick data here, and we are going to console log here, just so we see if we are able to actually listen. All right, so one thing we shouldn't forget is whenever we add a listener here, we want to unregister it every time this component gets unmounted. So what you can do is we can return a cleanup function. So a cleanup function, so in the cleanup function, this is code that gets run whenever this component is unmounted. So here, what we want to do is we want to do device event emitter. Then we want to say remove all listeners. So now that we are here, what we need to do to be able to test it out is to actually go ahead and render our toast component somewhere. Now, like I said, we want it to be global, meaning that it doesn't matter where the user is, this should always show. It doesn't matter if they are logged in, if they are not, this should always be able to show. So we're going to go to our app.js. So in the app.js, we have a setup for React navigation. So what we're going to do is to actually render this even on top of all our screens. Notice that on my iOS, it is appearing on top here. And of course, we're going to have to style it better and put it somewhere where it's looking good. But right now, let's first go ahead and test out if we're actually able to register the listeners. We're going to go to our home. So let's say whenever a user went ahead to press our show success button, we want to go ahead and do toast. So here we want to do toast, and we're going to import our toast from helpers, and that will give us the functions we can call. So if I do dot, you can see we can call danger, info, and success. So let's go ahead and call success, and let's pass the options that should be picked whenever it gets called. So let's send a message, and in this case we can say hello. Alright, so this should be able to trigger the function, and the function should emit the event. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring up the console just so we can see if we have any console logs, and I'm going to go ahead to the device and click show success. So whenever I click show success, notice that down here we have access to the message and the type that got called with that event. So mean that we're able to listen to the events in the toast component, and we can now act on them. Okay, so what you can do, so what we're going to do now is come to our toast component, and we want to make sure we are rendering it very well. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to add some styles to this view. So I'm going to do style, and here we're going to pass a position, and you're going to be positioning it absolute. So when I do that, notice that it disappears. We don't know where it is. So we want to specifically specify. So we want to specify where exactly it should be. So we're going to do bottom 4%. Let's also go ahead and add left. So I'm going to do left 4%. Let us also do right, and I'm going to give it some background for now. So I'm going to say background red, and notice that we still can't see it. So whenever we are positioning things absolute, we want to pass the z index. So I'm going to do z index 1. We want to pass a z index that is greater than 0. So if I go ahead and save this, I'm going to go down here and reload by pressing an R. So when I do that, notice that we have hello world being shown here. At least now we are positioning it in a way that we can build on that. So if you go on Android, notice that it is still not showing, and the reason for that is on Android, instead of us using the Z index, we need to use the elevation, right? So when I pass elevation and pass a value that is greater than 0, and when I specify a 1, you can see that now it shows in the UI. Alright, so let's continue styling this one a bit. Now remember, whenever we click on the text, whenever we click on the toast, we want to be able to dismiss it from the UI. So we're going to wrap that text inside Attachable Opacity. So to make it look better, we're going to go ahead and style the text one a bit. So let's go ahead and give it some padding. Let's give it 14. Let's give it 14. Let's make the color white. Let's increase the font size a bit, and let's align text in the center. So text align. So when I save, I'm going to go here and reload. I'm going to click an R in the terminal. And when it comes, you can see that we have a bigger toast showing. So what I want to do now is to give it some border radius. So in the container, let's do a border radius. Let's do a 4. Save that. And now this has a border radius. Let's check the iOS, and it also has a border radius. So instead of us using the hard-coded text here and also using the hard-coded background color, we want to be using the color and the text depending on what toast was emitted, right? So what you can do is here on the toast, we're going to have a few state variables. So we're going to have the message type, and then we can have a function to change that. So set message type, and it's going to start out as null. So we can do use state null, and also let's have the message, and it will also start out as null. Alright, so whenever a new toast is emitted and we get the data, we want to be able to update these state variables with the data that got sent through the toast. So what you can do here is we can set the message to the message that came through. So we will do data.message, and we can set the type. So we can set the message type. So set message type to the type that came through the data. So data.type. So this is going to make it that every time we emit a new toast, we can access the data sent through that toast, update our component states, and we can access now those values in our component state. So that means that we can go down here, and instead of using hello world, we use the message that actually we have here, right? So what I want to do is, before we render anything, I want to first check if we don't have the message. Then I want to return nothing. So let's return null. So we don't even see it when we don't have anything to show, right? So down here, I'm going to refresh, and we shouldn't see anything because there is no message. But when I click on show success, notice that now it comes and says hello toast, right? Okay, so and I'm guessing that is the message we are sending. So I'm just gonna say works now, and now when we trigger it, notice that it says works, meaning that we're actually able to get the message that the user would want to see. So now what you can do is actually fix that background and make sure we're using the one we are having. Alright, so to be able to use the corresponding background color, I've added the simple object here that has the corresponding colors for the info type, success type, and also the danger type. And you know that whenever we get the toast, we get access to which type was emitted with the event through the message type. So that means that here, instead of us using the hard-coded red, what we can do is we can reach out in our colors object, and we can pick out the one with this type that got emitted. So I'm going to go ahead and save here, and notice that now it is using, the success one. So that means that, let's say in the home, we also emitted the error. So I'm going to go in this one and also emit the error. So we can come here and say an error occurred. Obviously, we need to change this one to danger. And I'm going to reload here. So now when I come and click show error, notice that we get an error occurred and it's looking okay. On Android, it is still working the same. Alright, so now we are done with that, but we have a dilemma because our toasts don't actually disappear after a specific period. So now the next thing you're going to need to do is make sure that our toasts can disappear after a specific period. In our case, we want them to disappear by default after 5 seconds, but we want to also make it configurable such that from where the toast is called, we can be able to say maybe take a little bit more, right? So what you can do, so in the toast, what you can do, just like we set our state variables, we are going to state a state variable for the duration. We are going to be using 5 seconds by default, so we're going to set that one as the default value. But here, whenever the event gets called, we want to check if actually this toast was called with a specific duration. So we can do that by doing if data.duration. So if that's the case, then we want to go ahead and use this duration instead. So we can do set. So we're going to go ahead and set timeout duration to the duration that the toast got called with. And I want to put this one first here because we don't want to show the message when we have not really known which duration to use, or if we have not updated the duration to use. Now that we have this, is we are going to have to maintain a countdown duration that observes how long the toast has been showing, and it goes ahead to clear it out if its show duration exceeds our timeout duration. So what we'll do is here we're going to have a use effect. So for this use effect, we are going to be depending on the message. So every time we see we have a message, so what we'll be doing is we're going to go ahead and set a timer. Now we're going to be achieving that by using the set interval function. Now that allows us to run some code after a specific period of time. So what we want is we want after every 1 second that the message has been available, we want to reduce its show duration. So what you can do here is we are going to set timeout duration. We are going to set that to its current value minus 1 second. Basically what this is saying is whenever we have a new message, start to reduce how long it should show after every 1 second. So whenever it was 5, it's going to become 4, become 3, become 2, become 1, become 0. And whenever it reaches 0, we want to go ahead and close it out. So here we're going to do an if. So we're going to say if the timeout duration equals 0, right? So if it is equal to 0, then we want to go ahead and clear it out. So we're going to have a function called close toast, and we're going to go ahead and call it here. So if it's 0, we want to close the toast, but otherwise we want to go ahead and reduce the previous count that it had. So let's put this one in an else, just so we don't run both pieces of the code at the same time. So now we need to create the close toast function that's gonna be able to remove the toast from the UI. So right here we're gonna do close toast. It's gonna be a function, and its responsibility is going to be removing the toast from the UI. Remember, we have this check here that says, hey, if the message is not there, go ahead and return nothing. So that means that you can actually go ahead and utilize that. So what you can do is, for us, you can just go ahead and reset the message. You can just go ahead and reset it to null. Let's also reset the countdown since it was 0. So let's set timeout duration back to the default one. Okay. And hopefully this should do, but some of the things we have to take care of is here we have to consistently be listening for when we have a new message. So whenever we have a new message, we are going to start the countdown for that very message, right? All right, so we also have to add a timeout duration here, just so it can consistently listen for when it has gotten to 0, right? Okay, so now that we have this, whenever we create an interval, this is code that constantly runs. It's like a loop that keeps running in the background. We always want to make sure that we close it. We always want to make sure that we clear it every time it has finished doing its job. So what you can do here, now this interval here, we're going to clear it. We are going to need to clear it in different places. For example, you're going to need to clear it every time, let's say, we close the toast. So what you can do is we're going to store its reference inside a ref, so that we can be able to access it through that ref anywhere in the component. So we're going to come here and use the useRef hook. So I'm going to do const timeout. So we're going to do const timeout ref. Then we can do useRef. And its value is going to start out as null. So we can pass a default value there. Just make sure we are importing useRef. So now whenever the interval gets set, we want to set its value. So we want to do timeout ref.current and set it to this interval here. All right, so that way we can have access to this ref that is containing our interval. And now we can go ahead and make sure that every time this component gets unmounted, we return a cleanup function that should go ahead and clear interval. So there's a function called clear interval that we can use to remove intervals. And in this case, we want to go ahead and remove the interval that is stored in the timeout ref.current. All right, so now that we are done with this, we can actually go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to go ahead and console log the timeout duration somewhere, just so we can see if we are actually clearing it. So I'll console log it here. Now we're going to go ahead and restart everything. Notice that at first it is 500, but when I go ahead and click, let's say, show success, you notice that it comes in the UI. You can see that it starts out as 500, and whenever a message comes into the UI, we go ahead and start reducing it until we reach 0. So whenever we reach 0, we clear it from the UI and we reset the timeout, meaning that now we can be able to call another toast, and it's also going to have the same behavior. So after 5 seconds, it leaves the UI. So let's go ahead and test out if we're actually able to do our custom durations config setting. So in the home, whenever we call this one to show success, let's go ahead and pass it a configuration for the duration. So we can do duration, and let's say it should show for 10 seconds. And now if we go here and click show success, notice that down here it starts from 10 seconds and it goes down until it reaches 0, and only then it should go ahead and leave the UI. Alright, so now that is working, and I think you're going to need to do is actually take care of the Android and make sure that we take a look at how to use the Android native toast. So what we'll do before we do anything else, whenever a toast is sent, we are going to check if the toast actually wants to use the native one on Android. So here we're going to check if the platform we are running on. So we'll do platform.os. We're going to check if we are on Android, and then we're going to check if we should show it using the native toast. If that is the case, then we're going to be using the toast Android component. Then we're going to be using the toast Android component from React Native and show the message that the user sent. So obviously you can access the message here from data.message. I want to use the .long here because whenever you use the .long, it actually takes a while before it leaves the user's screen. And I also want to be returning it here just so we don't run any other code below. Alright, so now that we have this, then we can go ahead and call one of our toasts using this config here. So we'll go to our home. So we'll go to our home. You see where we have use native toast. This is where we're going to have to call it from. So we'll do toast. Then we want to do, let's say, info. And of course this won't matter because it's gonna be overridden by the native toast. So let's pass the message. We're gonna say I'm native. Then we wanna pass the config for use native toast and pass it as true. Otherwise it's gonna be undefined, meaning that this code would never run if it's never passed, right? So now and when I come and say use native toast, notice that we get the I'm native lol, and it is using the built-in toast. Alright, so the last thing we're going to need to do is make sure that we can animate it when it comes into the UI. So instead of it just popping up like that, we need to just fade it in just so it looks a little bit better. And we're going to be doing that using some utilities from React Native Reanimated. So we're going to go here and import a few things. Alright, so we are going to gradually change its opacity from 0 to 1. And we can be able to save the values that we are going to dynamically change through an animation using the use shared value. So here we're going to have a value. I'm going to call it animated opacity, and it's going to start, and then we can do use shared value since we want to affect it through an animation. And then we are going to start it out as 0 because we want to transition from 0 to 1 since opacities are 0, 0.1, 0.2 up to reach 1, right? And then we need to create a style that can contain values that are controlled through an animation, and we can do that by creating an animated style. So I'm going to do a const animated style, and we are going to be using the use animated style. It actually also takes in dependencies. It should return a style object, which should be like the normal style object we have in React Native. So in this case we want to return the opacity, and the opacity is going to be our animated opacity in this case, since we are going to have to control it through an animation. So here let's go ahead and return animated opacity. Now whenever you're using shared value, this is not the real value of the animated opacity at the moment, and we can get the real value by doing a dot value on the shared value, and that should be able to give us the real opacity like 0.1, 0.2 depending on what current value it is. Alright, so now that we have a style that has our animated opacity that we can use, we are going to go to where we show the toast, and instead of using this view, we are going to use an animated dot view. So this is just a regular view, but this one is able to handle showing a notification, and we are also going to have to use our animated opacity in this case, just so it can control how it comes into the UI. Now, to be able to, now since the other one is an object and we already have our style object, what we can do is we can combine two styles by passing them as an array, and at the end we can also go ahead and pass our animated style. So this way, let me go ahead and actually make sure we're using animated style, animated view here. So this way, if I go ahead and refresh, oh, by the way, here we should have used animated opacity. That's what's funny. So here we should have used animated opacity. Sorry, I forgot that. So let's correct that. And now, so let's correct that. I'm going to refresh here. And now if we come and click on show success, notice that it doesn't come. Notice that it doesn't show in the UI even when the component got triggered. The reason for that is our opacity is still at 0. So let's go ahead and turn it to, let's say, 0.5, right? So let's say we turn it to 0.5. I'm also going to go ahead and refresh. And now if we come and click show success, notice that it comes into the UI, but we are not able to see it clearly. That means that the opacity, so that's because the opacity is 0.5. Now we need a way to control this opacity dynamically whenever the component comes into view and transition it over a period of time from 0 to 1. So let's start it out as 0, right? So what we need to do is we're going to have a use effect, and that use effect is going to be listening for when we have a new message. So I'm going to remove this toast here actually, and here we're going to say use effect. So we're going to be listening to when we have a new message. So we'll put a message as a dependency. So then we can come here and check here if we have a new message. Then what we need to do is we want to transition our opacity from 0 to 1 over a period of time, right? So what we can do here is we can do animated opacity. We want to do dot value, then we want to set it to a value like 1. But since it's going to be an animated value, we want to be changing it using the with timing utility, for which it allows us to give it the value we want to go to. So previously we were on 0 and we want to go to 1. So with this we can also be able to configure how long it takes by passing an object, and in there we can pass a duration. So we want it to come into view by taking off 1 second. So it should transition from 0 to 1. Inside, it should transition from 0 to 1 in the duration of 1 second. Alright, so we also should have the animated opacity here. Alright, so now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and refresh everything and come and click on show success. So whenever I click show success, notice that it just transitions in from 0 to 1 for the opacity, and that looks a lot better than the default. So notice that now whenever we click show success or show error again after the first one showing, we are not able to actually show the UI again. And that's because whenever it leaves the view, we also want to go ahead and reset our animated opacity. So we're going to go to where it closes. So this is our handler for when it closes. Then we want to do animated opacity. We want to change its value, and we're still going to use the with timing utility. And then we can change it to 0. We don't want it to take any transition. We don't want it to take any time before disappearing. We just make it disappear. And now I'm going to go ahead and refresh here. And when it leaves the UI, I can also be able to trigger show error, and you can see even error is working okay, and the transition is working. So the last thing we have to do is make sure that the user can actually be able to press on this toast and dismiss it. So here what we'll do is we're going to do, and whenever it gets clicked, we'll call the close toast function, and that should be able to clear out everything. Whenever it is the user who triggers the toast, our timer is not reset. So that means that we also need to make sure we clear out our timer even in this function here. So what you can do is make sure that we also clear the timer in the close toast. Alright, so let's come on here. I think there was a warning somewhere. So if we go ahead and refresh here, we can go ahead and update this. So whenever we update, this is a function. Now React is going to suggest that we put this function in a use callback. That makes sure that this doesn't get called every time the component re-renders. So what you can do is actually copy the whole body of the function, and you're going to put that inside the use callback hook. So let's have use callback here. Then use callback. So the signature for use callback is you pass your function, and then you can pass some dependencies, and if that function code depends on some variables, and for the dependencies we're going to have to add the animated opacity there, and that should do. So if I go ahead and refresh one last time to test, show success, you can see it's working, and it should be the same thing for even this.